The truth. Now, the truth should be a good in its own right, an end in itself, crucial in a democracy because otherwise, without it, we are unable to hold politicians to account for what they promise. In war, it becomes a matter of life and death. And so, of course, we return to the horror of the current onslaught against Gaza, which we keep talking about because our governments are directly complicit in the massacre that is currently taking place. Now, the current death toll is around 3,500, over 1,000 children, a child dying every 15 minutes. Now, I want to talk about how the Israeli elites, the Israeli authorities lie and lie and lie and lie. Very important, not least because they're throwing huge amounts of propaganda at Western audiences. Now, there's been some debate about the Al-Ali hospital and whether an Israeli strike was responsible or a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket. Now, I'll come on to this, but first, here's what I said on Good Morning Britain, starting with a case of Shireen Abu Akleh. She was a US-Palestinian journalist shot dead last May. Israel originally claimed she'd been killed by a Palestinian gunman. It was, in fact, Israel.
Shireen Abu Akleh last year. They started releasing video footage at the time to claim it wasn't them. 5 months later, they admitted it was. There was another terrible example last year of 5 kids who were killed by what they claimed was a misfired rocket by Islamic Jihad. Again, months later, when attention had moved on, Israel admitted it was them. We know, by the way, this hospital was previously hit by Israel. We know that Israel called for it to be evacuated. I mean, the problem is Channel 4 News did some really good investigative work on it, and they found that the recording used to suggest that there was Hamas operatives admitting that it was a misfired rocket was probably almost certainly faked. What Israel needs to do is let the International Criminal Court in. They're refusing to do so. I mean, what we do know, and, you know, we talk about the fog of war and all the rest of it, but listen to what Israel's leaders are actually saying and their officials are actually saying. When, for example, the defense minister says we're going to have a total siege in which water, electricity and food are cut off because we're fighting what he calls human animals, and he says everything will be eliminated. When another official says that Gaza will be reduced to a city of tents. When one of their senior military lawyers says that the only way of destroying Hamas is destroy every building in Gaza because every building has Hamas operatives in it. Or yesterday, for example, the foreign minister openly just says that Israel will annex Gaza or parts of Gaza. These are all in violation of international law. It is a war crime. To commit a siege in which you cut off water, for example. So we know that hospitals are being attacked by Israel. We know medics, courageous medics. I spoke to a medic yesterday who was in Gaza for many months. Unbelievably courageous medics who are at the moment being attacked. And we also know that the hospital system is imploding. And just on that one statistic, because we think about the missiles which are killing people, 50,000 women in Gaza are pregnant. The hospital system has collapsed. The generators, the electricity to those hospitals are gone. And we have people who've obviously been struck by missiles, but you can think of people with cancer, with very serious health conditions. The health system is imploding.
Now, just some basic examples of the Israeli authorities lying, egregiously so. Now, one example is of the Welsh cameraman James Miller, a 5-time Emmy Award winner who was shot dead by the Israeli Defense Forces in 2003 while filming a documentary in Gaza. After the IDF fired at him and his colleague, James Miller his colleague yelled, "We are British journalists." A second shot was fired, which killed Miller. Now, the IDF claimed he'd been killed after entering a combat zone where there was a risk of crossfire. They churned out misinformation. Back in the UK, a jury eventually returned a verdict of unlawful killing, finding that he was murdered. A classic sniper shot, that's how it is described. One expert told the inquest it was calculated and cold-blooded murder, and the closest the Israelis then came to admitting guilt was paying the family a £1.5 million payout for several years, in 2009, several years after he was killed. I mentioned the case of Al Jazeera's Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot dead in Jenin camp whilst wearing a jacket marked press last May. Al Jazeera accused Israel of deliberately targeting her at the time, but Israeli forces went on to, after killing her, raided her house, confiscated Palestinian flags. The then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett posted a tweet blaming her death on Palestinian gunmen. Video was cited and circulated in as evidence, as proof supposedly, that it wasn't the Israeli military. Now, it took a huge amount of work by journalists and NGOs because Israel refused to conduct a criminal investigation, but it's clearly established that Abu Akleh and her colleagues were deliberately targeted. Now, it was only September last year, so 5 months on, when attention had moved on, that the Israeli military admitted she was likely killed by Israeli fire that wouldn't charge soldiers. Now, then there's massacres perpetrated by Israeli forces, like the Kana massacre in 1996 in southern Lebanon, when IDF fired artillery shells at a UN compound, killing 106 Lebanese civilians. Now, the commando unit at the time was commanded actually by Naftali Bennett, who I mentioned, became prime minister later on. Now, Israel claimed Hezbollah was the intended target, but they'd had outdated maps, like they didn't know there were hundreds of people there. That the IDF chief of staff declared at the time, "I don't see any mistaken judgment. We fought Hezbollah there, and when they're firing up, we will fire at them to defend ourselves." But a UN report found the Israeli story was almost certainly a pack of lies, that it was unlikely, they said, that the shelling was the result of gross technical or procedural error. The Kana massacres are only one of a multitude of incidents, they wrote, constituting persistent and gross violations of the human rights of Lebanese civilians perpetrated by Israel. It is also one instance, they noted, where the UN possesses or controls the evidence necessary to establish Israel's responsibility for these violations. Now, another much more recent example, last August, during Israel's bombing of Gaza last summer, 5 Palestinian children aged between 4 years old and 16 were killed during that bombing. Now, at first, the Israeli army blamed it on a rogue Islamic Jihad rocket. It was 9 days later before Israel admitted responsibility. Now, there are many other examples. The fact at the moment they keep claiming there's no humanitarian crisis, completely wild behaviour. In the current war, for example, they keep claiming the south of Gaza is a safe zone, where they've ordered the northern population to move to, when journalists and those on the ground have repeatedly said that Israel has bombed and killed in the south. We also know that Israel has repeatedly bombed healthcare facilities, which is obviously relevant. Ambulances have been repeatedly targeted. According to the work by the Washington Post, 15 hospitals have now been damaged, and 15 healthcare workers have been killed and 16 injured. Hospitals have run out of electricity and painkillers. The healthcare system faces collapse during a humanitarian crisis, and that's before a land invasion has begun. Now, as for the bombing of the Al Ali Arab Hospital, absolutely horrific, a truly horrible loss of life and mass injuries. Now, Israel has claimed it's a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket. The US has backed them in that, and various media outlets have as well, but it's being strongly disputed, not simply by the Palestinian authorities and many Middle Eastern governments, but also by various credible media outlets. A conclusive investigation has been prevented by Israel's all-out war against Gaza. I think we would all like definitive answers, but that's being prevented from happening. What I would say is Al Jazeera have just released an investigation in which they say they find no grounds for the Israeli army's claim that the strike on the Al Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza was caused by a failed rocket launch. Do look up that investigation. Obviously, Al Jazeera are a very credible media organisation, and the work that they do should be taken very seriously. But also, I did refer to Channel 4 News' very balanced report, and here's an excerpt from that.
Happened.
They present what they say is 2 Hamas operatives talking about the attack.
بس بقول لك الأول مرة بنشوف الصاروخ زي هيك والشظايا هذه فبقول لك تبع الجهاد الصواريخ الجهاد الإسلامي هاي.
Hamas call this an obvious fabrication. 2 independent Arab journalists told us the same thing because of the language, accent, dialect, syntax and tone, none of which is, they say, credible. Equally, Israel claims the Islamic Jihad failed missile was fired from here, a cemetery very close to the hospital. But look again at the video of the event. The trajectory of the missile doesn't line up with that location. Too high, too horizontal. Confusingly, the Israelis' presentation also says the missile was fired from a location down in the southwest. It can't be both. Islamic Jihad say it was an Israeli missile and they have the warhead to prove it, but they haven't produced it.
That's a balanced report. Note at the end that they say that Islamic Jihad hasn't produced a warhead. What I would say is that those who doubt the official Israeli narrative do so for a very obvious reason. The Israeli establishment lies and lies and lies. It has done so over and over and over again. Now, I'm not saying you should trust the word of Hamas either, obviously. The point is, we do have journalists, aid workers, NGOs, UN officials, medics, etc. on the ground. Obviously not nearly enough because of the terrible situation and the difficulty of travelling around what is a tiny, tiny strip, by the way. But at least we can get reliable information from inside Gaza, which tells us what's happening and how it contradicts the narrative being fed by the Israeli authorities. Now, a final point, if it does turn out to be a misfired rocket, which causes absolutely devastating loss of life, in the Russia-Ukraine war, there have been examples of misfired Ukrainian rockets causing civilian loss of life. So, for example, last September, and I'm going to struggle to pronounce this, a market in Kostyantynivka killed at least 15 civilians in Ukraine. Last November, a missile hit a village in Poland, killing 2. In both cases, Ukraine passionately blamed Russia, holding them entirely responsible. Subsequent investigations found it was Ukraine that was almost certainly responsible. Now, is that used to detract from the broader context that there is a war of aggression being waged by Russia against Ukraine and that Putin's forces have committed grave atrocities, war crimes, and have killed innocent civilians? Clearly not. When Poland, I know, was accidentally bombed, NATO blamed Russia for it on the basis that they had invaded Ukraine. Now, that doesn't mean the truth doesn't matter with the hospital. B'Tselem, the human rights organisation, a courageous organisation, have called for the International Criminal Court to be given access into letting journalists. Now, the point is, it's so important to just make the point that Israel's authorities lie and lie and lie and lie again. And this fog of war we're talking about didn't just arrive. They are intentionally trying to manipulate what we know. Given, in this particular case, one basic answer is, for example, with the voices, the recorded supposedly of Hamas, which experts believe is fake. So why have they manipulated evidence if they have their slam dunk case? Very clear questions, which can't be answered because Israel won't allow people on the ground to investigate exactly what happened. Now, that's why it's crucial to always be profoundly skeptical, to say the least, of Israel's claims, and never to forget the context of a brutal and vicious and criminal offensive against Gaza, which has killed huge numbers of innocent people, left the healthcare system on its very knees, which is a euphemistic way of describing it, and with Gaza now in a state of catastrophe with just one element, which is the lack of water, people drinking from IV drips and from seawater, and that is a humanitarian crisis, catastrophe, that Israel is responsible because of their siege and because of the vicious bombardment, 6,000 bombs dropped in the space of a few days on a tiny strip the size of East London. Please like and subscribe. You support us on patreon.com/OwenJones84, and I'll speak to you in a bit.